That morning, the whole street came to a standstill. The red Ferrari that always gleamed in the garage at number 27 was gone. The gate stood slightly ajar, and the man everyone envied was silently watching the street, holding nothing but a cardboard box. Some whispered that he'd gone bankrupt. Others sighed he was running from debt. But no one imagined that behind that impeccable house and those luxury cars, a battle was raging, one he had been fighting alone for months. And what happened next changed forever the way the neighborhood viewed wealth, pride, and courage. Before we continue this gripping story, make sure to subscribe to the Curious Neighbor's Diary channel so you don't miss future tales that are keeping thousands of people hooked until the very end. And I want to know, which city are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. It's amazing to see people from so many places following these stories about neighbors who seem ordinary but hide events capable of transforming lives. Now, tell me something else. If you saw a neighbor suddenly selling everything off, what's the first thing that would cross your mind? Leave a comment before we go on, because the answer to this story might be very different from what you imagine. Number 27 on Palm Street was known to everyone. The perfectly manicured lawn, the precisely aligned lights, and the imported cars in the garage made the house a symbol of success. The owner was Eduardo, a man in his early 40s, polite, discreet, and admired by the neighborhood. He greeted everyone with a calm smile, helped out at neighborhood meetings, and never seemed to have a care in the world. When the Ferrari disappeared, the gossip started immediately. He must have traded it in for a newer model, or is hiding money. Rich people always find a way. But that same week, the luxury pickup truck also vanished. Then came the office furniture. A truck pulled up in front of the house and hauled away box after box. Eduardo watched it all in silence. His next-door neighbor was Clara, a retired teacher known for noticing details that escaped everyone else. One thing struck her as odd. Despite the move, Eduardo kept leaving early and returning late, always wearing the same wary expression. One rainy afternoon, Clara ran into him at the gate. "Is everything all right, Eduardo?" He hesitated before answering. Sometimes you have to let go of certain things. Her mind kept returning to those words. That night, the lights in the house stayed on past midnight, and for the first time in years, Clara saw Eduardo sitting alone on the porch, staring into the void. Something was very wrong, and what Clara discovered the next day made her see her neighbor in a completely different light. The next morning, Margaret woke up earlier than usual. The brief conversation she had with Ethan the day before kept replaying in her mind. Sometimes we have to let go of certain things. The words felt heavier than they should have. They didn't sound like the words of a businessman dealing with financial problems. They sounded like the words of someone carrying a burden far greater than money. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. When she saw Ethan's front gate open shortly after 7 o'clock that morning, she made a decision she never thought she would make. She was going to find out where he went every day. Ethan climbed into a modest sedan, a vehicle far simpler than the luxury cars he used to drive. Margaret waited a few moments before pulling out behind him. Keeping a careful distance, she followed him through the city streets. As the minutes passed, she noticed something unusual. He wasn't driving toward the business district where his company was located. He wasn't heading to meetings. He wasn't visiting clients. Instead, he drove across town toward an area Margaret rarely visited. After nearly 40 minutes, Ethan finally pulled into a parking lot. Margaret slowed her car and looked toward the building. The moment she saw the sign above the entrance, her heart sank. It was a specialized medical center, a hospital. She sat frozen behind the wheel. Maybe it was just a routine appointment, she told herself. Maybe she was overthinking everything. But then she watched Ethan open his trunk. He removed a backpack filled with folders and documents. And he walked into the hospital with the confidence of someone who knew the building very well. Someone who had been there many times before. Margaret decided to wait. 1 hour passed. Then 2. Then 3. Finally, the hospital doors opened again. Ethan emerged, but he wasn't alone. Beside him was an elderly woman sitting in a wheelchair. She appeared frail, exhausted. Yet when she looked at Ethan, her eyes softened with affection. Ethan pushed the wheelchair carefully, treating her with extraordinary tenderness. As if protecting the most precious thing in his life, Margaret watched silently. Every rumor she had heard suddenly felt foolish. This wasn't the routine of a man hiding financial mistakes. This was the routine of someone fighting for another person. Ethan helped the woman into a specially equipped vehicle. Then, believing no one was watching, he stepped away for a moment. What happened next broke Margaret's heart. Ethan lowered his head, covered his face, and cried, not loudly, not dramatically, hushed silent tears from a man who had spent too long pretending to be strong. For several moments, he stood there alone. Then he wiped his eyes, took a deep breath, and returned to the elderly woman with a smile on his face. As if nothing had happened, as if his pain didn't exist. Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. For the first time, she realized how little anyone in the neighborhood truly knew about Ethan. Over the next several days, she continued observing discreetly. Every morning, the same pattern repeated. Hospital visits, long appointments, medical consultations, hours of waiting. And every evening, Ethan returned home, looking more exhausted than before. But the biggest discovery was still ahead. One afternoon, Margaret spotted Ethan sitting alone on his porch. His shoulders looked heavier. His face looked pale. The fatigue in his eyes was impossible to ignore. She considered walking over to speak with him. Before she could, his phone rang. Ethan answered immediately. Margaret couldn't hear the entire conversation, but she heard enough. His expression changed instantly. The color drained from his face. His hands began trembling. Then he spoke words that Margaret would never forget. I'll get the money. A pause. Please, just give me a little more time. The call ended. Ethan remained completely still, staring at the ground, as though the weight of the world had just landed on his shoulders. Margaret didn't approach him. She didn't ask questions. She simply watched. And in that moment, she understood something important. The luxury cars, the missing furniture, the boxes being loaded into trucks, the sleepless nights, the hospital visits. They were all connected. But one mystery remained unsolved. Who was the elderly woman? And why was Ethan willing to sacrifice everything he owned for her? The answer would soon change not only Margaret's understanding of Ethan, but the entire neighborhood's understanding of sacrifice. And when the truth finally emerged, many people would be forced to confront the cruel assumptions they had made about a man they never truly knew. Because Ethan wasn't fighting for his wealth, he was fighting for someone he loved. And that fight was becoming more expensive by the day. Before we continue, tell me what you think. Who do you believe the elderly woman is? Do you think she's a family member, a lifelong friend, someone from Ethan's past? Or is there an even bigger secret waiting to be revealed? Leave your theory in the comments below and tell us what city you're watching from. I'd love to see your predictions before the truth comes out. After overhearing Ethan's desperate phone call, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about him. For days, she replayed everything she had seen. The hospital visits, the missing possessions, the tears in the parking lot, the growing exhaustion in his eyes. Little by little, the pieces were coming together. But one important question still remained unanswered. Who was the elderly woman, and why was Ethan willing to give up everything for her? The answer arrived unexpectedly. One afternoon, while walking through the neighborhood, Margaret ran into the neighborhood, who had recently returned to town after several years away. They exchanged pleasantries before the conversation naturally turned toward Ethan. Margaret hesitated at first. Then she mentioned the hospital visits. Daniel immediately became quiet. His expression changed, and for several moments, he simply stared at the ground. Finally, he sighed deeply. So he's still trying to do this alone. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Trying to do what? She asked. Daniel looked around carefully before answering. The woman he is taking to the hospital every day is his mother. Margaret froze. His mother. Suddenly, everything felt different. Every sacrifice, every tear, every sleepless night, everything. But why doesn't anyone know? Margaret asked. Daniel shook his head. Because Ethan never wanted people to know. Why? Because he believes some battles should be fought in private. Margaret listened carefully. Daniel continued. His mother has always been the most important person in his life. He paused. And now she's fighting for her life. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. Daniel then revealed the truth that changed everything. Ethan's mother had been diagnosed with an extremely rare illness. For years, doctors had tried different treatments. Some helped temporarily, others failed completely. Each time hope appeared, disappointment seemed to follow. But recently, a new possibility had emerged. An experimental treatment. A treatment that wasn't guaranteed to work. A treatment that carried risks, but also a treatment that offered something they hadn't had in a long time. Hope. The problem was the cost. The treatment was so expensive that even financially successful families struggled to afford it. For most people, it would have been impossible. And suddenly, Margaret understood. The Ferrari, the luxury SUV, the furniture, the investments, the savings, everything Ethan had been selling. Every sacrifice had been made for one purpose, to keep his mother alive. Daniel lowered his voice. Do you know what's remarkable? Margaret shook her head. He never complained. Daniel looked toward Ethan's house. He never asked anyone for help. Another pause. He never told anyone what he was doing. Margaret felt a wave of emotion wash over her. While the neighborhood had been busy creating stories about Ethan's downfall, he had been quietly sacrificing everything for someone he loved, and nobody knew. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She thought about every rumor she had heard, every assumption, every judgment, every careless comment. She thought about how easy it is to believe we understand someone's life simply because we can see their house, their car, or their appearance. But the truth is often hidden behind closed doors, and Ethan's truth was far different from what anyone had imagined. The following afternoon, Margaret finally decided to speak with him. She found Ethan sitting alone on his porch. Cardboard boxes surrounded him. The signs of his sacrifices were impossible to ignore now. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret gently broke the silence. I know about your mother. Ethan's eyes widened. The color seemed to drain from his face. For several seconds, he said nothing. Margaret wondered if he would deny it. Instead, he slowly lowered his head and nodded. Silence hung between them. Then Ethan finally spoke. My mother spent her entire life taking care of me. His voice trembled. When I had nothing, she believed in me. His eyes filled with tears. When nobody else thought I would succeed, she stood beside me. Margaret listened quietly. Now it's my turn to believe in her. The words struck her deeply. Ethan took a long breath before continuing. The doctors didn't promise a miracle. He stared toward the street. They didn't promise anything. Another pause. They only gave me a chance. Tears rolled down his cheeks. And as long as there's a chance, I can't stop fighting. Margaret could barely hold back her own tears. In that moment, she understood exactly who Ethan really was. Not a wealthy businessman, not a successful entrepreneur, not the owner of the nicest house on the block. He was simply a son refusing to give up on his mother, no matter the cost. But just when it seemed things couldn't get any worse, they did. Later that same day, Ethan received devastating news. The treatment costs had increased again. The amount he still needed was enormous. Even after selling nearly everything he owned, he was nowhere close to reaching the required total. For the first time since this battle began, doubt crept into his heart. He had sacrificed almost everything, and it still might not be enough. What Ethan didn't know was that the truth was about to spread. And when the neighborhood finally learned what he had been hiding, something extraordinary would begin to happen. Something that would change his life forever. Let me ask you something. If you were in Ethan's position, would you sell everything you own for even a small chance to save someone you love? Why or why not? Leave your answer in the comments below and tell us what city you're watching from. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the greatest acts of love happen quietly, when nobody is paying attention. Margaret didn't sleep that night. Ethan's words kept echoing in her mind. As long as there's a chance, I can't stop fighting. But now that she knew the truth, something inside her had changed. It was no longer just a story she was observing. It was a human life hanging by a thread. And worse than that, it was a man silently carrying everything alone while an entire neighborhood misunderstood him. By morning, Margaret had made a decision. She couldn't stay silent anymore. She had to tell the truth. Not to one person, not in whispers, but to everyone. The neighborhood meeting Margaret requested an emergency meeting at the community hall. At first, people thought it was an exaggeration, but curiosity spread quickly. Within hours, the room was full. Neighbors sat waiting, some annoyed, some curious, some already judging. Whispers filled the room. Is this about Ethan? I heard he lost everything. Probably another rumor. Then Margaret stepped forward, and the room went silent. The revelation, Margaret took a deep breath. For weeks, we've all been talking about Ethan. She paused, and we've all been wrong. A murmur spread across the room. We thought he was losing his wealth. We thought he made bad decisions. We thought he was failing. Her voice grew firmer. But none of that is true. Silence. He is not bankrupt. Another pause. He is not hiding financial mistakes. She looked around the room. A is selling everything he owns to save his mother's life. The reaction was instant. Confusion, shock, disbelief. What? That can't be true, Margaret continued. She is in a hospital receiving an experimental treatment, and Ethan has been paying for it alone, without telling anyone, without asking for help. The room fell completely silent. The kind of silence that feels heavy enough to press down on your chest. Then came the shame. A man near the back lowered his head. A woman covered her mouth. Someone whispered. We judged him. Margaret didn't stop. And now the costs have increased again. He is running out of time. That sentence changed everything. The moment everything shifted, a chair scraped against the floor. Someone stood up. Then another person, and another. A man who had criticized Ethan the most walked forward without saying a word. He placed money on the table. Then another neighbor did the same, and another. Within minutes, the entire room transformed. It was no longer a meeting, it was a response. A collective reaction to guilt and compassion. People began organizing immediately. Leads were created, phones were called, funds were collected, contacts were shared. But the most powerful change wasn't the money. It was the realization. Ethan had never been what they thought he was. The discovery. While the room turned into organized action, Margaret felt something cold in her chest. Ethan didn't know any of this yet, and if he didn't know, he might still be alone in the middle of his breaking point. She grabbed her keys immediately. I need to find him. Two neighbors followed her without hesitation. They checked his house. Empty. They checked the hospital. No sign of him. Minutes turned into panic until someone shouted from across the parking lot. I see him. The parking lot. Ethan was standing outside the hospital, completely still, not moving, not speaking, just staring at the entrance as if something inside was pulling him in two different directions. Margaret rushed toward him. Ethan, he slowly turned. And for the first time, there was something different in his expression. Not panic, not exhaustion, but surrender. I was about to end it, he said quietly. The words hit everyone like a shockwave. I was going to stop the treatment. Silence. A neighbor stepped forward. No, you don't have to do this alone anymore. Ethan shook his head. You don't understand, but before he could continue, a hospital nurse ran toward them. Mr. Ethan, it's your mother. His heart stopped. She's asking for you. Everything froze. Then Ethan started running. And this time, he wasn't alone. Margaret and the neighbors ran with him. The hallway felt endless, every step heavier than the last. When Ethan entered the room, everything went silent. His mother was awake, weak, but smiling. You look tired, my son. Ethan tried to speak, but nothing came out. She reached for his hand. I heard everything. His eyes widened. I don't want you to sacrifice yourself for me. Tears filled his eyes instantly. I can't lose you. She shook her head gently. Then listen to me. The room held its breath. I had a good life because of you. Ethan broke down completely. But I don't want your life to disappear because of me. She looked toward the door, at Margaret, at the neighbors, at the people who once judged him. Take care of him. Silence. Then a nurse entered quickly. The treatment approval just changed. Everyone froze. Margaret's breath caught. The new protocol has been approved for emergency partial coverage. For the first time, hope wasn't just a word. It was real. Sometimes, the people we judge the most are the ones carrying the heaviest burdens in silence. And sometimes, it only takes one moment of truth to change an entire community. The hospital felt different that day, heavier. Like the air itself knew something was about to break. Ethan stood in front of the administrative desk, holding a document in his trembling hands. A single signature was all it would take. One signature to stop the treatment. One signature to accept that he had reached the end of what he could afford. One signature to give up. Behind him, Margaret and the neighbors rushed through the corridor, but they were already too late to stop what he was about to do, or so it seemed. De decisión, Ethan stared at the paper. His mind was no longer thinking about money. It was thinking about time. About his mother's face, about the nights she tried to smile through pain, about everything he had already sold just to keep her alive a little longer. His hand tightened around the pen. This is the only way, it whispered. But deep down, something inside him was breaking. Not because he wanted to stop, but because he was running out of ways to continue. The arrival, Ethan. A voice echoed down the hallway. He froze. Margaret. Then footsteps. Then more voices. The entire group arrived breathless, shocked, and out of time. A neighbor stepped forward immediately. No, don't sign that. Ethan didn't turn around. You don't understand. Margaret walked closer. We understand more than you think. Silence. For the first time, Ethan lowered the pen, not fully letting go, but hesitating. That hesitation was enough. The truth of a community, one of the neighbors placed a folder on the desk. We raised money. Another stepped forward. And we contacted specialists. Another added. The treatment cost is covered, at least for now. Ethan slowly turned around. His eyes filled with disbelief. That's not possible. Margaret shook her head. You're not alone anymore. The pen slipped slightly from his fingers. For months, he had carried everything alone, silently, desperately. And now he didn't know how to stop carrying it. The message from the room at that moment, a nurse rushed in. Mr. Ethan, your mother is awake and asking for you again. His body reacted before his mind did. He dropped the document and ran. The final encounter inside the hospital room, the atmosphere was calm. Too calm. His mother looked weaker than before, but her eyes were peaceful. Ethan rushed to her side. I'm here, she smiled faintly. I know. He held her hand tightly. I almost stopped everything. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. Listen to me. Silence filled the room. You don't have to carry this alone anymore. Ethan shook his head. I should have done more. She interrupted him softly. You did everything. Tears filled his eyes again. But I don't want to lose you. She looked toward the doorway, where Margaret and the neighbors stood quietly. Then she spoke words that stayed in everyone's heart. If I leave, don't let him forget how loved he is. A long silence followed. Then the monitor beeped steadily. A nurse entered and spoke gently. The new treatment approval has been confirmed. Full continuation is now possible with community and emergency support combined. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Ethan broke down completely. Not from loss, but from relief, from exhaustion, from finally not being alone. Epilogue: the neighborhood that changed days later. The street felt different. No rumors, no judgment, no distance. Only people who now knew the truth behind the house at number 27. Ethan didn't return as the rich neighbor. He returned as something else entirely. A reminder that behind every closed door, there is a story no one sees. And sometimes, the people we misunderstand the most are the ones fighting the hardest battles. Margaret stood on her porch one evening, watching Ethan and his mother sitting outside together, alive, present, still fighting, but no longer alone. Before the story ends, ask yourself something. How many people have you judged without knowing their full story? And how many of them were actually fighting battles in silence? Leave your answer in the comments and tell us what city you're watching from. And if this story moved you, subscribe to the channel because every neighborhood has a story waiting to be discovered.